I just noticed that in transferring from my Mac to this system, some of the font has changed. So I hope that the format, the font is fine. I don't care what font it is, but the format I hope will be okay on the slides that you're going to see. So my title, as was said, is Early Phonological Development. And I consider early about from birth to 3 years. And I think that I want to talk about phonological development starting in the prelinguistic period. So a good deal of what I have to say will be about what happens prior to the onset of words. In many cases, we think of phonology as the beginnings of phonology as only appearing when we have evidence of meaningful speech, of word production. So there are two parts to this talk, and the first is about what's happening, the process of acquisition. I'll be looking at a prelinguistic vocal development, I'll be looking at the phonology of early words, and phonemic acquisition to about 36 months. And these will be fairly general statements that I'm making. Most of the data will be based on English, but cross-linguistic studies show that much of what happens in English is the same as, in the early stages at least, is similar to what's happening in other languages. The second part of the study, the talk will be about quantitative measures. So when I tell you something that so-and-so found this or so-and-so found that, you always need to look very carefully at the methodology that was used. What kind of sample was used to collect the data? What kind of analysis was used? Was it transcriptions? Was it acoustic analysis? What was the focus of the study? And then how did the author or researchers interpret the findings? And we will talk about each of those. So let's start with prelinguistic development. When I use the term prelinguistic before language, so this means that these kind of vocalizations that we have that I'll be discussing are non-meaningful. It is interesting, so at 7 months when the American baby says mama, and the mother says, oh, he said my name, he says my name, he says mama already, he knows who I am, etc., etc., and they're very, very happy, which is good. And it's good that they say mama back to the baby, but I hate to tell them that when the baby says mama at 7 months, it's highly unlikely that that is a word for the baby. And we'll talk about that. Much as it is very exciting for the parent, or papa. Mama and papa are two very common babble types, and they also happen to be words for mom and dad in a lot of languages. We'll also look at prelinguistic development and how it relates to speech and language development in the meaningful speech stage. They're not just totally unrelated. And we'll be talking about feedback loops and communicative factors, interactions that are going to influence the way that the child acquires the phonological system of his native tongue. Okay, so this is a lot in this slide, but this is just an overview, and I'll break it down. But we talked about stages in prelinguistic vocal development, and whenever I say stage and I give some ages, please remember there's a lot of variation across infants and across young children. These are kind of benchmark, common age estimates for these particular periods. Now there will be a time when if a child has not reached a particular stage by 4 months, is 4 months late in reaching a particular stage, that may be a concern. That may be an indicator that the child will have difficulty with subsequent speech-language acquisition. But some variation is to be expected. And so if you have a baby, and I say the baby should be doing something and your baby is not quite doing that, that is probably not a concern. Okay, so what happens when I say a new stage? We move from one stage to the next. It's not that the sounds or the production types of the previous stage disappear. It's rather that new vocal behaviors are introduced on top of those that were previously there. So it's an expanding repertoire as we move from our reflexive or vegetative productions to our first words. Okay, so in these first 6 months, in the beginning, babies definitely make noise. They're not silent, They make noise at birth. But these noises are far from being speech-like. And nobody would say, oh, mama, he said mama, when he's 2 weeks old. But so what kinds of productions do we have? Well, we have cries, we have sneezes, burps, and maybe some vowel-like, soft vowel-like sounds. So these are called vegetative or reflexive, automatic bodily reactions to something that's happening. You need to sneeze. You cry, perhaps, not in the beginning, but after a while you learn to cry communicatively. Burps, well, they happen. And they happen throughout our lives, so it's not something that goes away. So those types of very, very basic phonation and production types are going to exist throughout life. But by around 2 months, 2 to 3 months, we see a change. In addition to the reflexive and vegetative productions, we have a stage that's called cooing or gooing. And I don't know if you have a word for that in Korean and what that word is. But supposedly the name cooing or gooing, it was given that label because it sounds like if there are any consonantal elements in a baby's productions, it's kind of back consonants. So it sounds like the baby is maybe making a k sound or a g sound. And that's why it was given that label. What do we hear in the cooing and gooing stage? We hear a lot of nasalization in terms of vowel types. We hear some back consonants, not clear syllables at all. But importantly, by this time, at 2 to 4 months, we start seeing some turn-taking going on. By turn-taking, I mean the baby will say, ah, and the mom will say, ah, and then the baby will say, ah, and the mom will say, ah. And people have looked at the timing of this turn-taking, and it's actually quite conversational. They don't clash. The baby will take his turn, the mother will take her turn, the baby will take his turn, the mother will take her turn. So this is already laying the foundation for some conversational interactions. And we do see that some babies who are not developing, who have atypical development, for instance, Down syndrome babies, they do clash. They don't have this turn-taking. Much as they do babble, they don't have this turn-taking reflex that we see in typically developing babies. Okay, and at 4 to 6 months, again, this is additive. At 4 to 6 months, we have the stage that's called vocal play or expansion. Okay, things are getting bigger, and what do we mean by vocal play? Well, it seems as though, and you can never get inside a baby's head, but it seems as though the baby is kind of testing the range of what she can do with her vocal apparatus. So she has really nice feels, and she has yells, and she has whispers, and she has creaky voice. And so it's none of these are phonation types that are necessarily used in normal speech, in meaningful speech, but it does give the baby an idea of the range of phonatory types that can occur that I can produce with my vocal apparatus. We also have raspberries, if you know what raspberries are. Those aren't good when the baby's eating, because you get food all over. But it's a very tactile sensation, and many babies kind of like this. And again, they kind of start using this. If the mother does this back to them, then they will start using this in a turn-taking way, which probably should not be encouraged. So those are the first 3 stages, and they're all in the pre-canonical stage. We would not say that these productions are speech-like in any sense, meaning they don't really sound like words. They don't sound like an adult or even a child, the way an adult or a child. Okay. But if we move to the next stage, this is a very important stage, canonical babble. So this is the stage where we hear, and it starts around 6 months. For some babies it's 7 months, even 8 months. If it's 11 months, it's pretty late. But canonical babble is productions of CV syllables. And they're often in a sequence, so we can have or and those are each, the ones that I just did, are reduplicated babbles. And we have somewhat what we think are more advanced babbles where we have 2 different syllable types within the same utterance. So madiwa. Okay, so 3 different consonants within the same utterance. Now what's interesting is if you look acoustically at these, the transition between the consonant and the vowel is relatively adult-like. So it's not meh, it's ma. It's not bleh, it's ba. Okay? So these are becoming more speech-like for sure, and resembling at least some syllables in the target language. The other thing that we know when we look across babies from learning different languages is that the types of consonants that tend to occur in the canonical period is quite small. The types are limited. Okay, and I'll give you some more information about that. But this is when we say the vocalizations are somewhat speech-like. They could be interpreted as speech. And so this is when the mom or the dad says, ah, he just said my name. Okay. So, the phonetic features, this gets very, do you think we can turn off the lights? I had a slightly larger font. Is it okay? You can see it? Okay, that's fine. So, the phonetic features of these. There's been a good deal of research cross-linguistically on babbled productions in the canonical stage. And pretty much across languages, we see the same types of consonants. And again, like most of these talks, I'll be talking mostly about consonants, but of course, we have to consider vowels as well. So what do we have in terms of consonantal types? We have stops. So those are, well, you know what stops are. And then our nasals, glides, and a fricative S. Some people call H a fricative also. I don't really care how it's classified. But those are the types of consonants that occur frequently in canonical babble across languages. In terms of vowels, we tend not to have the corner vowels that are very discrete. We tend not to have a good E or a good oo, rather I and maybe the thing. So they tend to be what we would categorize as lax vowels. We do see, especially maybe after 9-10 months, some language-specific features. So we may see different frequencies of consonantal use. For instance, babies acquiring French or living in a French-speaking environment produce babble that has more nasals than do babies raised in the United States. And presumably that mirrors aspects of the French language. And we also see some prosodic domains. So when the baby gives a long babble, the prosody will sometimes match, is more likely to match the ambient language, and so will vary across languages. And as I said before, these babbles may resemble words of the ambient language. Okay, and the last stage is one we call jargon babble. And I must say, I have 2 kids. Neither of them did much jargon babble. I think there's a great deal of variation across children in their use of jargon babble. And what I've observed is that babies who do a lot of jargon babble are somewhat later to get to words. If you're trying to do words at 12 months, you probably don't have much jargon babble. If your first words are occurring around 15 months, in the months prior, you may be using, quote, jargon babble. And by jargon babble, I simply mean long strings of CV syllables, or even just vowel syllables, that have intonation that sound like statements or sound like questions, but you can't identify anything that's meaningful within that production. Okay, so if we think about babble and early words, it's clear that there are some strong similarities between the production patterns of very early words. So I'm talking about first 50 words, first 100 words that a child is going to produce, and this canonical babble. And so I've listed some of those connections. First, we have the predominance of CV syllables. So we know that many early words, some words, even the target word is simply a CV, but often a baby that's producing a word that has a final consonant may only produce the CV and not the final consonant. So yes, there is predominance of CV syllables in both babble and early words. So if you think of words, again, I have to say English. I wish I knew more Korean. But so mommy, daddy, baby, all of those are going to be CV forms. Also, the productions are relatively short. We can have monosyllables or disyllables. And then, you're going to keep hearing this, there's a predominance of stops and nasals and glides in terms of the segments that occur for these early words. Now, we have looked at some longitudinal data. So if a child does something at 6 months, is there any influence or any correlation with what that same child does at meaningful speech stage? And yes, indeed, there have been links, both between lexical acquisition, so now I'm talking about learning words, and phonological acquisition. Your pronunciation system of those words is related to your babble. So the number of CV syllables that you produce in babble is linked to the age, and this is usually between 9 and 10 months, is linked to the age of your first words. And I must tell you, when I say first words, one word isn't enough to say baby is in the meaningful speech stage. In my studies, I usually say a child has to have a production of 10 words. Because we've seen cases of children, particularly if they have a word like uh-oh, which is a good word in English and very easy for babies to say, but all it's for 4 months, all they have is uh-oh. It's their only word. I would not say that that baby is in the meaningful speech stage. To be in the meaningful speech stage, you have to have a small repertoire of words that you're trying to say. You may not say them correctly, but you have to have more than a single form. Okay, so the number of CV syllables in babble is linked to age at first words, more CV syllables, earlier onset of words. And the second measure is the same, but looking a little bit further out. The number of CV syllables in babble linked to the age of a 50-word vocabulary. So now for sure you're in the meaningful speech stage. You might even be producing utterances, 2-word utterances, but you're definitely producing meaningful speech. Both of those are linked to how much CV babble you produce. Okay, and if we look at phonology, we can go out even further. So we're not talking about first words, we're not talking about 50 words, we're talking about babble at 9, 10, 11 months, and accuracy of production at 29 months. So this is a long period of time. And again, we see a relationship. More CV syllables at 12 months, higher accuracy of production at 29 months. And also we can see, if we measure things at 3 years, 36 months, we see the same type of relationship. And so when I say phonological skills, we're talking about more than just accuracy. We're talking about phonetic repertoire and some other measures. But it's essentially the same thing. So, as I just said, longitudinal findings, more babble, better outcomes in both speech and language, both lexicon and phonology. And so this is where speech-language pathologists get interested, because they see babies who, for some reason, don't enter the stage of meaningful speech. And it'd be good for them to try and find out, often from parental report, what kinds of vocalizations their baby made after 6, 7 months, when their baby started producing certain types of utterances. Well, if we ask why we have these links, at least one hypothesis that makes sense is that the more you practice, the more consonantal vowel syllables you produce, the more, in a sense, the more developed are your speech motor skills. If you only say and that is a CV syllable, but it's not a good canonical vowel. If you only have that, it's not going to help you much with speech motor development. But if you have a variety of CV syllables, you're in a sense laying the foundations for subsequent word productions. Okay, so none of these will be surprising. A larger consonantal inventory in babble. What are the different, how many different consonants does the baby produce? And you usually have to have some criteria for saying the baby has this consonant in his babble repertoire. I mean, one instance is not enough. But substantially, a larger consonantal inventory in babble is linked to better speech-language skills. Again, why? Because there are more sounds available for word production. So we can think of these as building blocks. I know how to make this particular sound. Now I'm going to try and put it into a word. If you've never made that sound before, like je, first of all, it's very low frequency in English, not in French, but very low frequency in English. You don't hear it much on input. It's pretty hard in terms of articulation. It's very late acquired in English. It's the last phoneme to be acquired in English. So that's an extreme example, but b is example on the other side. Very common in babble and very early in words. Okay, So now we'll look at some other mechanisms that appear to be involved in this link between babble and speech. So the first mechanism I'm going to talk about is what I'm calling the internal feedback loop. Auditory, articulatory. So what happens here? And this, we don't know for sure. This seems to be what is going on. At least it's a hypothesis about what's going on. So first, the baby can hear his own babble. Okay, so if you're deaf, you don't get this stage. And we know that children who are deaf, even if they have a cochlear implant, pretty early their early speech production doesn't resemble that of children with normal hearing. So the baby hears his own babble. He says mama or dada or baba or whatever he says. And he listens. It becomes to form a link between motor movements that he used to make that and what it sounds like in terms of a production. So this is your internal loop. If I close my lips and I phonate, I can make and that's what it sounds like. When I want to call up an sound, I will remember what I have to do. So you're learning the link between the articulatory movements and the resultant production. Now we have an external loop also. And so this is linking babble to the ambient language. So again, the baby hears his own babble, and hopefully, he notices the similarities between his output and parental input. So the adult says a lot, mama, oh mama, I'm mama, you like mama, mama help you, mama whatever. And so this will be the external loop of the baby recognizing that his own production is similar to something that is common in the input language, in the ambient language. In fact, is Roman Jakobson, who I talked about a bit yesterday, if people were here, actually wrote an article that was entitled "Why Mama, Why Papa?" And what he noticed was that many languages, maybe somebody can just tell me, so what are the words for mama and papa in Korean? Anything like that, those?
Mama.
Okay. All right, good. So he wrote this article, Why Mama, Why Papa? And what he noted was, well, if we think of English, the real word for mama is mother. Well, that is not a child-friendly form. Neither is father. Anything with fricatives is not child-friendly. And so what do parents do? They take on nursery labels so the child can call them something that is within the repertoire of the child's productions. So mommy and daddy are the common words in English, and these are well within the production capabilities of a baby at 12 months, 13 months, 14 months. Mother and father are well beyond the production capabilities, and babies don't say mother and father very, very early. So Jakobson looked at several languages, I don't know really, I can't remember how many, and noted how many languages have this predominance of something like mama and papa, and maybe dad. Where's that at? Okay. We also have another form of loop, kind of a conversational loop, where the parent hears the baby's babble. The parent notices similarities between babble and words of the language. So, once again, baby says mama, parent hears mama, and the parent imitates and models the productions that are speech-like. So the mother says back to the baby says mama, mother says mama, baby says dada, daddy says dada. Again, if you think of the baby who says there's nothing, at least in English, that's going to tie to. It's not likely to elicit a response from the parent. So we need something that's speech-like and word-like to be able to elicit the adult input. Okay, so let's go to a brief summary of prelinguistic development and its relationships to speech. So prelinguistic development provides a foundation for the phonetic and phonological patterns of words. It establishes the feedback loops needed to establish articulatory patterns and to monitor production. So the baby has to listen to himself. He needs to be able to recognize when he made a mistake. And also during this period, the babies and the caretakers, usually the parents, but not in all cultures, babies and the caretakers begin to engage in conversational interactions, turn-taking. Okay. But I always have to remember, we're talking about phonology, and phonology generally talks about words. meaningful speech. So there are clearly important differences between babble and words. Babble is not speech, and we need to remember that. Canonical babbles, there's no link to meaning, whereas words, definition of a word is, it's a pairing of sound and meaning. And so there's clearly a more difficult and critical element in words. So, continuing with differences between babble and words. Words have underlying representations, and we could talk for hours about underlying representations, and I'll just throw out some ideas that have been put there and that I believe, but I think depending upon the language, that the ambient language, the underlying representation and the notion of underlying representation may be quite different. But we know that underlying representation is something that's, quote, stored, we believe that, I guess, we can't get into the baby's brain, but it's stored in the mental dictionary, we call it. Okay, every word the child wants to say, he's not just going to say it willy-nilly, he has to remember, oh, that's the word mama or shoe or daddy or whatever. So these words are stored in the mental dictionary, and then they have to be accessed somehow for both production and for comprehension. So when the mother says cookie, the baby has to know that there's a form in his mental dictionary that sounds like cookie. So that's on the acoustic side, on the input side. Otherwise, he's not going to understand the word. Okay, what is included in the mental dictionary? Well, I think most people would agree it's something about words, lexical items, and morphemes. Now, it's been argued, and I think there are data that support this argument, that in the early stage, the underlying representation for some words includes morphemes. It's not that the baby knows this is the lexical root and this is the morpheme I'm going to add. He simply stores a form that he hears. And if he normally hears it in the plural in English, that's the form that gets stored. Then, as he learns more language, he realizes that this little thing on the end is going to marks more than one. And so we don't know that for sure, but I think there is some evidence from both perception, well, mostly from production, that supports that notion. Okay, so we have the words and morphemes. We also have to have semantic and syntactic information. So what is it? So when I say mama, what does it mean? And it's clear that for some children, mama simply means a female adult. It's not necessarily their mother. And so, or, daddy means a male adult. So a child is in public and he says, daddy, daddy, and he points to someone who is not his father. And so the father immediately says, no, daddy, daddy. And so there's a partial representation in terms of the semantic features. They also have to have, the underlying representation also has to include both articulatory, how do I say this, and acoustic information. When I hear this, what is it linked to in my mental dictionary? So there's a lot. And we all have, of course, mental dictionaries, and those of you with more than one language have, mental dictionaries for all of your languages, and I don't know quite how separate they are, but they are there. And as I say, there's little agreement on the precise nature of underlying representations. People agree that there is such a thing. Exactly how they are stored and accessed, there are varying views. Okay, so now let's move on. Let's move from babble and get on to phonological development. And we'll talk a little bit again about ages and stages. So first words appear between 12 and 15 months. And there's nothing wrong with your baby if at 15 months it's usually a boy, he doesn't yet have any productive words. But by 18 months, if he doesn't have words, that's worrisome. So high degree of individual differences. By 18 months, the common average is that a child has a 50-word vocabulary. So, and I'm talking about production, and I'm talking about, who cares what the phonology is? The word is recognizable. There may be many errors, but the word is recognizable, 50 different words. And so, as I say, simple production patterns with a limited set of syllable types. Okay, if we move on, so if we think of first word at, let's say, 13 months, by 18 months we have 50 words, but by 24 months we have 250 to 300 words. So all of a sudden there's a real expansion of vocabulary. And at the same time, an expansion, ideally, an expansion of the phonological system. So larger phonetic inventory and more types of syllable shapes which can be combined. to make different forms of words. And by 30 months, now we have a hard time actually estimating, but we do have some ways of trying to look at vocabulary size at that age, and it's probably around 1,000 words. And again, this is going to vary across languages and across children, but again, a huge difference between 24 months and 30 months. Now, if you have a really small phonetic inventory, if you only have 5 consonants, hard to make 1,000 words that are different and are recognizable. So you start thinking of a child with a speech disorder who has a very limited lexicon, very limited phonological repertoire, and you can see why it seems like the child doesn't have many words. Well, that may well be because he can't differentiate among these 1,000 words that he actually has stored up here. Okay. So, we go back to Jakobson, who wrote this very provocative book, 1941, translated in 1968. He proposed that phonemic acquisition of all children, regardless of the language they're acquiring, will follow the same order of acquisition. And the error patterns can be predicted from this order of acquisition. There's a lot of support for this notion, but there are a few things. Okay, first I'll talk about the support, then I'll talk about some few things that he missed. So, we have simple syllable and word shapes. Jakobson talked about that. We have simple sounds in terms of articulatory complexity, stops, nasals, glides, and we have almost no clusters, because presumably clusters are more complex. Some languages have no clusters, so those children get a free ticket. They never have to learn how to produce 2 consonants in a row. And in terms of error patterns, again, Jakobson said that we can predict error patterns based on a child's phonological repertoire. So you can't, you can make stops, and you can't make fricatives and affricates. So what do? You produce the target fricative as a stop in more or less the same place of articulation. So an S, target, may be produced as a T. Velar consonants, back consonants, are fronted to either dental or alveolar, depending upon the language. Clusters are often reduced to a single consonant. Word final consonants are often deleted. Weak syllables are often deleted. This is all English. But I believe many of these patterns hold for other languages. And there are many voicing errors. Most of the languages that have been looked at have been looking at your VOT errors. Okay. So, if we believe Jakobson, it sounds like the child is just born, and then this thing starts moving, and we have this unfolding of a predetermined pattern of acquisition. And to an extent, that's true. There was a lot of data that shows that. But I do want to go briefly through this notion of what's called lexical selection. I hope I'm doing okay on the time. Okay, what is lexical selection, and how does it relate to phonological development? So, we're looking now at words and sounds. And what people noticed, the first people were these people on the bottom, Ferguson and Farwell. Ferguson was my dissertation advisor. They noticed in some longitudinal samples that young children appear to choose words for their vocabulary based in part on phonological characteristics of those words. Not on semantic, not because they want to say hi or bye or mommy or daddy, but for other phonological characteristics. So here are 2 examples. So we have a child with a small vocabulary. By small, I mean fewer than 50 words. That's when we have this really simple, tend to have a really simple phonological system. So there's one child that they looked at, had a high proportion of words with sibilants. Now sibilants here, s, je, etc., are typically late acquired. And yet this child had words like cereal, shoes, cheese, juice, eyes, ice, and sit among her first 50 words. That is rare for English. I'll talk more about what kinds of words we have in English. And not only did she choose these words, she could make some sibilant form. So she didn't produce a s and a z and a sh correctly, but she produced these words with a sibilant form. And that's actually pretty rare in the first 50 words. The second study was my son. And he clearly chose words in his first 50 words that ended in a K. They were mostly CDC words, and they all ended in K. And it was quack, rock, clock, sock, whack, milk, frog, and he pronounced them all talk. So a very simple output form, but an input form that he liked, that he chose words from from the surrounding language. And so, as I say, the child appears to select words with segments or sound classes he can produce. And there is some experimental data where children are introduced, where the researchers looked at the child's phonetic and phonological repertoire and developed words, nonsense words the child had never heard, and looked at which words tend to be acquired. And again, this notion of lexical selection was supported. I went on to look at some other aspects of lexical selection. And I looked at what's the MacArthur Communicative Developmental Inventories. That's a parental list that parents are given at about 6 months or earlier. And they're simply asked to mark, does your child say these words? There are 700 to 800 words on the list. And so it's a lot when your child is only 12 months. You don't have very many things ticked. By the time your child is 30 months, you probably have more words that are on the list. But so parents identify the words the child attempts. Now again, we're not talking about production. We're talking about what words the child has in his productive lexicon. And what I noticed was that there's this really strong preference for target words beginning with B in English. So I looked at the first early acquired words according to the communicative, I'll just call it the CDI. And I looked at the age of acquisition for CDI words, which I set as the age at which 50% of the children of a particular age had the word in their productive vocabulary. So the very first word, sorry mothers, the very first word to reach this criterion for English was daddy. And the 100th word was soap. Okay, but so I looked at the phonetic composition of these words. And what I noticed was that B, 22 of these first 100 words begin with a B. And so compared to any of the other phonemes, all of the vowels put together, and any other individual phoneme, B was overwhelming. And so then I thought, well, maybe they just like words with B. So I had to look more. And we look at word final position. So what sounds occur at the ends of words on the CDI? Well, a lot of words have open syllables, baby, mommy, daddy, etc. But there wasn't one word that had B in final position. So heavily present in word initial position and not existent and not chosen in word final position. Again, this is across ages. I'm sure there's some child who had a B final word. So why? So maybe it's that B is common in Babel, and we know that it is fairly common, but if we look at the thing on the bottom, let's see, this is going to work. No, back. Sorry. I'll just say, the word that, if we look at the most frequent consonants shown at the bottom, B is not the most frequent consonant in Babel. It's among the most frequent, and again, this is cross-linguistic data, but I believe that our data from American English mirrors that. So maybe it's because adults use a lot of B words in talking to their kids. So I'll quickly go through these. So this is comparison of words in the B words in the CDI lexicon and in an adult dictionary. B is not common in the adult dictionary, only 5%, but very common in the child words. Okay, so maybe it's that we have to look at interactions. So we can look at word initial phonemes in a lexicon, and we can also look at it in dyads, in conversational speech. So your blue line is conversation. Your light blue line is conversational speech, and we see that B is not the most common. It's not the least common at all, but it's not the most common. So that doesn't seem like the best explanation. And lastly, if we look at tokens rather than types, so before we were just looking at one word, each word gets a mark. So now we'll look at tokens. So across a whole speech sample, what's the most common? Word initial consonants, well, vowels, and the DH is the ed, like this and that and these and those. And B, again, is not the most common not the most common initial consonant in token analysis of adults to adult speech and adult to child speech. Okay, so I'll go to this one. Then I thought, well, maybe just babies like B, you know? And so I tried to look at some other languages using CDI data from those languages. So I looked at Korean, Japanese, and Spanish, and I do have details, and I won't go into them today. But I can say that looking really carefully, that none of these have a predominance of B initial words. Okay. So now we're moving on to the second topic. So we've talked about these studies, and again, I hope you're asking yourself, well, how did you get those numbers? How did they get their numbers? What measures did they use when I make these statements? And so we'll talk about a little bit about the types of databases that people are using, the goals of the research, and the types of analysis that are used. Each of these is going to have consequences for the outcomes that I talk about. Okay, what kinds of data sets are used? Well, initially, basically all we had, and all Jakobson could ever use when he wrote his book in 1945, were diary studies. So this was usually a linguist parent, and often the father, who took notes on his child's development. Very good notes. There's some wonderful diary studies, but it's an N of 1. So it's not terribly representative, yet very interesting. Then we have these longitudinal, I'm calling them small N studies, few subjects, but you look at these subjects over time. Sometimes months, 6 months, 9 months, sometimes years. So you do have an idea of longitudinal development, but in a small set of children. And then we have these cross-sectional studies, single age, but many children. And then we have cross-sectional and many children at a particular age, or many children at many ages. And I'll give at least one example, some findings from one of the last type of study as I go on. So when you hear something, you need to say, what kind of data set was being used? And so then we also need to know, again, what is the nature of the data? So is it conversational samples? Well, conversational samples are great because they are very representative of what the kid wants to say and how he says it. And you get more than just phonemes and syllable shapes, etc. You get intonation, grammatical complexity, and you can also listen to the input to see what types of input a child is getting. However, if you want to make comparisons across children, this is really hard because in many cases, you don't have a wide variety of phonemes in the child's productions. And some of the utterances are going to be unintelligible. And we can talk about unintelligible speech a little bit later, but for many analyses, you have to be able to identify the word before you can make the analysis. Okay, the second type that has been used is what I would call a semi-structured sample. So it's not a word list, but it is setting up a situation where you can collect data on a particular aspect of phonology you're interested in. So maybe you put out lots of words that have fricatives in them. Or I had a student who wanted to look at multisyllabic words. So we had elephant and hippopotamus and helicopter and things like that. And these were spontaneous productions, but we loaded the data collection set with words of this type. And then probably what people know most about, or many people in the speech sciences, speech language pathology group know, are single word productions. And these are often articulation tests. So what are the strengths of articulation tests? All children produce the same words, hopefully. All phonemes are assessed. And so you can compare across children, and you can look across ages. You can give the same assessment test to a child at 2, and again at 2.5, and at 3, and track the development. The weaknesses are that this kind of approach is not appropriate for young children because they often don't know the words. They're not familiar with the words that are being shown on a picture card. So it works pretty well from 3 to 8 years. Not so well. I'm more interested in the 2-year-old stage, so it's not so good for looking at that stage. And then now that we have the data, we have to you need to look at what was the purpose of the study, what was the goal of the study. And so diary data, I think originally was just a linguist parent was interested in tracking development of his offspring. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have the articulation tests, and those are often used to create norms. So what are the expectations for a 3-year-old acquiring English? What are the expectations for a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, etc.? And you have to have a very structured sample to be able to get those expectations. Also, this is the kind of test that's used to identify a disorder. Okay. The small group data sets can allow us to look at individual differences because you can get a lot of data, but you don't have, you only have a small number of children, so you can actually analyze all those data. And then we also get data from children with phonological disorders, so we can document the patterns of the disorders and watch the change over time. Okay, so we have the data, we recorded it or whatever. Now we have to reduce it so we can use it in our analyses. And the most common approach for phonological development is phonetic transcription, and I'm sure all of you are phoneticians and you know the benefits and the difficulties with phonetic transcription, but that's what is typically used. And the transcription can be of a whole word, it can be just of a phoneme, and you need some sort of transcription reliability. You don't want just one person who may not have a very good ear doing all your transcription. You need to have it checked, a certain proportion of the data checked by someone else. Acoustic analysis is used for child speech, but not nearly as common as phonetic transcription. So if we go back to our prelinguistic vocalizations, I gave you a bunch of measures when I talked about that. It's usually phonetic transcription, and what do you learn? You can take measures of the number of utterances that were produced in a certain period of time, the number of canonical utterances. Remember I said CD syllables are linked to better speech, etc. The segmental inventory and suprasegmental patterns. And I developed a measure that's called the mean babbling level, which is useful in a way because it doesn't require close phonetic transcription of every utterance. So we have an utterance, which we have to define, of course, and you assign the utterance to a particular level. At level 1 are the simplest utterances. They're either vowels only or vowels with glottal consonants or glide. So ah, wah, or ha, 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 or ah, ah. Those are all level 1, or just ah, okay? Level 2 is your canonical syllable, but it's with the same consonant, so ba, 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 ba. And we did ignore voicing differences in terms of that consonant. You can have just one ba or many bas, doesn't matter. That's a level 2 utterance. And a level 3 utterance is has more than two different consonants. Has at least two different consonants. Okay. So you assign utterances to a level, and then you can determine the proportional frequency of each level, and you get the mean babbling level. Okay, so it's very, I would call it simple, but it's pretty straightforward. It's easier than transcribing and then looking at how many B's the kid made and how many D's, etc., etc. It gives you an overall measure of complexity of babbling. Okay, so types of analysis. First we talked about phonetic inventories. So phonetic inventory, again, based on phonetic transcription, looks at the utterances without reference to the adult target. Doesn't matter what they were trying to say. What did they say? Transcribe it. And then you can make your analyses. You can make a segmental inventory. You can look at syllable and word shapes. You can look at stress patterns. And you simply obtain lists of segmental inventory was this big. There was only one stress pattern. In English, that's very common. Stressed, unstressed in a 2-syllable word or even a 3-syllable word. So that's your phonetic inventory. And your second type of analysis, which is a lot more common in speech language pathology, is a relational analysis. This compares the child production with the adult target. It looks at similarities and differences. So if we look at similarities, we're talking about accuracy. So kinds of measures that are outcome measures are the percent consonants correct in a speech sample, conversational sample, articulation test, whatever. The percent phonemes correct if we want to include vowels. The proportion of whole words correct. I won't read through all of these, but you see that there are a number of different ways of looking at accuracy. And the other type of this is errors. So we look at the child production and we identify errors. These are usually in terms of substitutions, deletions, assimilations, and maybe atypical errors. And I give you examples of each of those, the substitutions, deletions, and assimilations. Again, based primarily on studies of speech. Okay, so just to give an example of some of the outcomes, there was a study by Sander, 1972. He looked at a large sample, it's more than 500 children. And whoops, no, let's go on. This is amazing. He came up with two criteria: customary production and mastery. He looked at articulation, excellent data from articulation tests, and he looked at phonemes in 3 positions: initial, medial, and final. So customary production, the age at which the combined average across word positions exceeds 50% correct. The age of mastery, the age at which the correct productions exceeds 90%. So it's kind of like half the kids can say it at the age of customary production, and 90% of the kids say it correctly at mastery. And this is across word positions. So I'll be showing the data. It's pretty. I'll be showing the data on the next slide. But look in particular at the data for the P, the D, and the S, and look at the time it takes to get from customary production to mastery. And this is why this kind of layout is informative. So the top is, we have our P, first bar, quite short. Then we have our, what did I say? Our D. Our D goes from age 2 to age 4. And our S, which goes from age 3 to age 8. So how long did it take from half of the kids being able to say it correctly to almost all the kids being able to say it correctly? And they're wild differences. Look at T. There's a problem with T, and I won't go into it, but there is a difficulty with the word that looked at T in medial position. That's why the T bar is so, the bar for T is so long. So we can kind of ignore that one. But this has been around, this type of analysis has been around for a while, and it's actually quite illuminating. Okay, my last measure I want to just say something about is intelligibility. And you who do second language learning know a lot about intelligibility. And we always have to note that it involves more than phonology. So a child with low intelligibility, it's not just that he has poor phonology. There may be other things as well. But what are our expectations for intelligible speech for a young child? At 2 years, about half his speech should be intelligible to a stranger. That means somebody who's not familiar, not the mother, because the mother always says, I understand everything he says. But the preschool teacher says, I can't understand anything that Joey says. So it's not the mother, it's a stranger. At 2 years, 50% intelligible. 3 years, 75% intelligible. By 4 years, 100% intelligible, but surely not 100% accurate. So an American child might say, it's a wed wabbit, meaning it's a red rabbit. Well, anybody who knows anything about kids and kid pronunciations would understand that wed wabbit is red rabbit. So it's intelligible, but it's certainly not correct. Okay. So, measures vary across studies. All right, thanks.